account of that. So we're so fortunate to have Rich here. Thank you for coming, and I'm going to have John Parshall do the introduction.
Thank you, Don. Our speaker tonight, as everybody knows now, having had two people steal all my thunder, is Richard Frank. Rich is the author of 4 books, the first being the definitive account of the Battle of Guadalcanal, still to go to account after decades. He followed that up with Downfall, which is another landmark study of the end of the Pacific War, the dropping of the atomic bombs, and the end of the Japanese Empire. Followed that up with a book on MacArthur, and now has just released Tower of Skulls, which is the first in a trilogy which I'm sure is going to be the definitive account of the Pacific War, that broader conflict for years to come. He is a member of the Presidential Council down at the World War II Museum, the author of articles and book reviews too numerous to count. So I think it's fair to say that he is what might be termed a plank holder in what he laughingly describes as the cult of Pacific War historians, which unfortunately for Rich means that he has to rub elbows with other members of the cult, including myself. Rich has had the dubious honor of having been my co-lecturer with the U.S. Naval War College for more than 10 years now, as we have lectured on both Midway and Guadalcanal. He has unfortunately also been stuck with me on more tour buses and airplanes than he probably cares to remember, as we have been co-historians for the World War II Museum on a number of tours. We've been across the Pacific together 2 times, and unfortunately for him, probably more to come. So I guess all I can say, Rich, is I hope in your next lifetime you manage to gather to yourself acolytes who are both better credentialed and much better looking. And with that, I welcome my good friend Rich Frank to the stage.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for providing this magnificent menu here. I want to thank the World War II Roundtable, and particularly Don Miller and his band of merry co-conspirators who put together these programs. I appreciate them very much. I want to thank John for that very generous introduction, which I'm going to have fact-checked, make sure everything is right, you know, as historians. I'm going to talk tonight, let me see if I can... there we go. Okay, there's the title slot. And I want to talk about what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk really in 3 broad issues, right, at the beginning here. And that's why I advocate the notion that we should regard this as the Asia-Pacific War, not simply the Pacific War, a war that began in 1937 and would continue in 1945. I also want to talk about one of the reasons why I think that it's important to link what we call the Pacific War with this much broader war in Asia, and the principal way to do that is by the numbers, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about early on, and particularly this is going to get into not only what I've already written in the first volume, but also where I'm going with the rest of the trilogy. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about Tower of Skulls, and I'm probably going to shorten up the end point here, whatever, in view of keeping everything marching on time. So with that, let me move into my remarks. We've had a standard narrative now for decades since World War II, and we talk about World War II beginning in September 1939 when Hitler attacks Poland and the war in Europe begins. And then we've customarily in this country talked about the other part of World War II, and which we've called the Pacific War, and we deem this as having begun when we get in December 1941. And what I'm attempting to do is to say, no, the really sustained continuous fighting, which is really critical to how the overall outcome of World War II is shaped, begins in July 1937 and begins in China. So with that, I want to talk also about how fundamentally what I'm trying to do is, it doesn't lack for ambition. It's to propose a new master narrative of the whole other part of World War II, the Asia-Pacific War. And to do this, I'm going to talk about numbers, which I think will make my case in terms of the significance of this. I'm going to talk about population. I'm going to talk about death count, which is particularly important in terms of understanding not only that war, but also the moral significance of it. And finally, I want to talk about the long-term consequences, because one of the aspects about this whole trilogy is it's not only going to talk about what happened between 1937 and 1945, but also argue, I hope convincingly, that it shaped the decades thereafter. And in fact, right down to today, the most significant single aspect of that is that without the Asia-Pacific War, there would be no People's Republic of China as we now know it in China. So the next step is I need to issue a warning, and that's that there'll be some math involved here, which among historians is frequently referred to as a weapon of terror. In fact, a great artist I found clearly was thinking about this sort of issue, and he created a significant artwork, which I think could be rendered as a subtitle of, Historians Encountering Math. And there you get the idea about what happens when you assemble a group of historians and you say, you give them the warning that we're going to talk about math, and this is a pretty typical reaction, in my view, from my experience. In 1937, the best estimate of the total population of the globe was about 2.3 billion people at that time. And in point of fact, the area, the Asia-Pacific region, contained at least 1 billion, probably closer to half the total population of the world. And as we say in math, show your work. And this is sort of the conglomeration of the most significant nations and peoples at that time. And you see that that total alone gets you to 1 billion to a little over 1 billion people. And that's not counting the US or some fraction thereof as being committed to the Asia-Pacific region. So you can see when I argue that this is a story that literally is about half the globe. Or you could phrase it the other way, it's a story in which we've been leaving out the better part of half the globe in the story of what we call World War II. More significant than that are the death numbers, in my view. And using a conservative approach to this in terms of the numbers, because there's always going to be controversy about specific numbers, and typically ranges are used for a lot of these areas because no one was keeping a fully accurate count. But basically, by conservative count, I figure about 25 million human beings perished in the Asia-Pacific War. Of that number, about 6 million were combatants, soldiers, sailors, airmen. These were overwhelmingly Chinese and Japanese. Total American deaths in the Asia-Pacific phase of World War II, counting merchant mariners and other folks, probably was somewhere around 118,000 of the total. Well, the math tells you immediately that if there's like 6 million combatant deaths, then there's going to be 19 million non-combatant deaths, which is more than 3 non-combatants dying for every combatant, which if you do a parallel thing for the European phase, you're going to find it's not even that bad in Europe. You can't get to 3-to-1 in Europe. You can get to 3-to-1 in the Asia-Pacific region, and it may in fact be worse. You also have the fact that of the 19 million dead, at a high-end estimate, the total number of Japanese non-combatant deaths is about 1 to 1.2 million people, which again, the math tells you that basically for every Japanese non-combatant who died in the war, between about 17.8 and 18 other human beings, overwhelmingly other Asians died. That ratio of 1 to 17 or 18 is truly stunning when you realize it, and it really gets to the heart of a lot of the moral issues about the war and our understanding and certainly our judgment about it. Now, when you start breaking the deaths down among these non-Japanese non-combatants, the most significant total, of course, is in China. I go by this standard that's set by Professor Ron Emitter of Oxford. His book, Forgotten Ally, is the best single overall volume about China's what they call the War of Resistance. We call it World War II. And he says that the reasonable range for calculating total Chinese deaths during World War II is somewhere between 14 and 20 million. And the 14 million figure by Rana's calculation is about 12 million non-combatants and about 2 million combatants. So I have taken the low-end number from Rana because my view is that whenever the low-end number will amply make the point that you need to make, there's no point in getting bogged down in an argument about still higher numbers, although certainly it would be available. So you've got 12 million Chinese non-combatant deaths. And you see I do the math there, 8 years, 2,963 days. You divide the days into the 12 million, and you literally get the fact that on an average projection basis, you've got 4,000 Chinese non-combatants dying every single day for 8 years. When you do the other part of the Asian death toll, and it is overwhelmingly Asians, this 5.8 to 6 million total. Again, this part of the war primarily involves Japan's actions from December 1941 to 1945. So that period is about 1,346 days, and you do the math here also, you get at least 4,000 a day. It's closer to like 4,300 a day if you want to do more precise math. So what this overall tells you is that from December 1941 to the end of the war, every single month, 8,000 non-Japanese non-combatants are dying, which is 240,000 per month. The figures I use for deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I use a figure of 210,000 immediate and latent deaths with a plus or minus of 20,000 on each side. You see the range. What this ultimately tells you is when you just crank this out, you realize that by the 1st of January 1945, there are 15 million non-combatants who've died in the Asia-Pacific War who are not Japanese. And up to that point, very few Japanese non-combatants have died. The largest group is in the Mariana Islands, about 13,000 in June to August of 1944. And that 240,000 a month continues all the way into August 1945. And very often, and when I get obviously to the discussion of what happens in 1945, what's almost inevitably omitted in the discussion of this, which is couched as basically a moral issue, is I'm simply at a loss to explain how we can do this without considering counting all the dead and according all the dead treatment as sharing a common humanity. And I had an experience a number of years ago. Someone was putting on a presentation very much along the line of a lot of the critical literature about how the war ended and the atomic bombs. I'm sitting next to a historian from the People's Republic of China who's very familiar with all of these issues. As I'm sitting there next to him, and I'd gotten to know him fairly well, I could see that he first was sort of baffled, and then he was really angry because he felt the presentation, which was very typical, made the war out as though Japan was the great victim of the war. And from the Chinese or the Indonesian or Vietnam or Korea, or you can go on and on and on with these other Asian nations, that is simply an anathema to them to have the war presented as a case of Japan being the great victim of the war. You'll notice also that basically, you know, that December 41 to January 1945, that like the equivalent of 36 Hiroshima and Nagasaki's, one occurring every month for 36 months. And as I said, goes on into August 1945. So you see from those numbers alone, you see the utter horror of what's going on in Asia. And I would emphasize that when you read my book, Downfall, one of the things I was very consciously attempting to do was to make sure that I was following count all the dead and treat all of them as sharing a common humanity. I gave very graphic description of deaths of Japanese non-combatants, particularly in the Tokyo fire raid in March 1945, which I started the whole book with, simply to underscore the horror of the whole thing at that time, and also a graphic description of what it was like to be on the ground in Hiroshima. So I'm not arguing to you that we should deprecate or not accord common humanity status to the Japanese. I'm simply saying that all of these dead are entitled to that status. Now, in terms of the scope of the war, and here I give a thanks to John who did the maps for me or whatever here. I've called this area the Arc of Asia, which is the area that basically runs from what was in India. And India at that time included both Pakistan and what's now Bangladesh. And if you run east across Burma, China, out to Japan and into the Western Pacific, or you run southeast down to what's now Indonesia, which was then the Dutch East Indies and Australia, whatever here, you're talking about a swath of the globe at that time that had 19, I call major nations and peoples, because most of these people were living in colonial status. Of that entire sweep, only 4 nation states had any claim whatsoever to sovereignty. 2, Thailand and Japan had actual sovereignty. Mongolia was a Soviet client state, had no real sovereignty. China had a very fractured and divided status as a nation state at that time. And the special case was the Philippines, which we had in 1934 promised independence in a decade. And the Filipinos were well aware of the fact that they were in the war, were fighting for a nascent nation, not merely a colonial possession. It had very important impact on the role of the Filipinos in their opposition to the Japanese during the war. Now, if you look at the world in the 21st century, you'll see that basically all of these nations and peoples now are in fact nation states, and they do have sovereignty. And when you start trying to do the totals and looking just at the major ones, you'll see that it's those 19 major ones plus Australia, New Zealand. There are 3 smaller nation states within the Asia-Pacific region, and then when you got into the Pacific, there are like 13 recognized UN states, which are mostly very small, very few, virtually none of them have even 1 million people in them. But that's the world that we live in now. And as I said, in the third volume in particular, I'm going to talk about how the path of virtually every one of those sovereign independent nations to where they are today in the 21st century was really importantly shaped or totally shaped by what happened between 1937 and 1945. So that's sort of the big overview about where the whole trilogy is going and why I think it's important. Once again, this trilogy is designed to write back into the history of 1 billion people. It tries to count and treat as sharing a common humanity 25 million of the dead. I'm also striving as I go along through here to look at what's happening both in the Asia-Pacific region and in Europe and tying them together. And finally, it really ties into where we are today. So this is not just a question of ancient history of what happened between 37 and 45. This is very much with us to this very day. Go over this pretty quickly, but in each volume of the trilogy, this is sort of the features that I followed in sort of my broad outline. The first of which is I'm using an integration of the Pacific War and the Asia-Pacific War in terms of this. I'm looking at Europe and the Asia-Pacific region. In 1937, China, I refer to it as a fractured state. And at that point, that black arrow is the area in Manchuria, which Japan had occupied in 1931, and then they extended, mainly by subversive actions, a little bit more subjugation of some more Chinese provinces up in the northeastern part of China. The rest of China, beyond that area occupied by Japan at that time, was this incredible mosaic of regional and local power brokers. It was not, as we've tended to think of the conventional wisdom, as already the Civil War, which is just between Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party and Mao Zedong and the Communist Party. At that point, by far the dominant party within China itself was run by Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists. They had 7 provinces in the lower Yangtze Valley. They controlled about 170 million people, which was something over a third of the 450 million people in China at that time. They were on track, I believe, to effectively extend control over the entire rest of China and eventually secure sovereignty for China before Japan commenced the war there in July 1937. At this point in time, if you look at that red arrow there pointing to that small area up in the northwest part of China, that's where Mao Zedong and the survivors of what's called the Long March have settled, and the area they control. And at that point in July 1937, the total population in the area under Mao's control was 1.45 million people, which is not 1% of China's population, it's 0.3%. As historian Donna Lowry wrote one time, that the notion that this sort of ragtag group is eventually going to rule China by 1947 was looked upon as an absolute absurdity in 1937. And that's another theme that runs through this trilogy, which is basically how was it that the Chinese communists got in a position to be able to take China by 1949? The answer was provided by Mao himself several times, and he said quite clearly that basically without Japan's war in China, we never would have triumphed. And he said that one time to the Japanese Prime Minister in 1972. So he always paid this sort of snide compliment to Japan in permitting his Communist Party to rule China from 1949. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists enjoyed sort of a roller coaster ride of understanding and popularity in the U.S. Between 1937, when Japan first attacked, through about 1942, they were treated very well, very favorably in American press accounts, primarily because the Americans were looking at these incredible images that were coming out of China of Japanese atrocities, Japanese bombing, and American sympathies had gone overwhelmingly for the Chinese against the Japanese. Then his reputation and that of the nationalists went into eclipse, and of course they eventually lose China in 1949, and it was all explained as that Chiang was never wanted to fight the Japanese, he was incompetent, they were corrupt, it goes on, this litany or whatever here. The single most important thing that has happened in terms of his reputation is that beginning in China, the People's Republic of China, after Mao Zedong's death, Chinese scholars began releasing a lot of archival information, which put a very different picture on the communist side of what had happened during the war. And most importantly, similar information came out of Taiwan with respect to where Chiang ended up after 1949. But the most important thing by far was Chiang Kai-shek's personal diaries, which were released in 2006. And interestingly enough, they've been installed in the Hoover Institution in Stanford University in the US. And as one PRC historian told one of my colleagues, he says, this changed everything. Once you read this diary and you saw the archival information, you realized that Chiang was a whole lot more than his negative reputation had held in those decades after about 1942-43. The most important thing was that after Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, Chiang realized that they were going to have a showdown war with Japan to restore Chinese sovereignty, but he understood all too well, he'd studied at a Japanese military academy, that this was a gigantic task, and China was in no position to take on Japan in 1931, and so he was on a program from 31 to 37 to build up the Chinese armed forces, economy, and population prepared to take on Japan. And there's all kinds of documentation now showing that there was very long-range planning to do exactly this, bringing in the German advisors, eventually the Soviet advisors, to prepare the Chinese armed forces to take on Japan. And he was quite clear in speaking to the leaders of the Nationalist Party that this is the path he was on. He gave a talk in 1934 in which he said we're only 1,000 days from war with Japan, and he was only off by 34 days at that time. So the notion that he never wanted to fight the Japanese, we now have fully put to rest with respect to the new archival information. So what happens is after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which is in July 1937, Chiang realizes at that point that if he lets the Japanese take the Beijing area, that's a step too far. His status as the leader of the Chinese fighting the Japanese is going to be challenged. He's probably not having a good answer to that at that point. He decides now we have to fight. But what he does do is he decides that, well, in the northern China area around Beijing is flat, open. It favors everything that the Japanese have as an advantage: firepower, mobility, artillery, air power, whatever here. The place to fight is in Shanghai, in the crowded urban area where Chinese numbers and small arms count a whole lot more against the Japanese than they would in the northern plains of China. So that's where the first great battle of the war of resistance, that the Chinese call it took place in Shanghai, and went from August to November 1937. This would be by far the biggest battle in a city until Stalingrad in 1942. Before it's all over, there are 750,000 Chinese troops who fight in Shanghai. There's 250,000 Japanese troops who fight in Shanghai. What is significant is that although the Japanese eventually will prevail, there had been literally a century of history that had gone on where the Chinese had been totally ineffectual against any westernized power. They had not been able to sustain combat against a westernized power for more than a few months or at most a year for literally a century. So the Japanese, as did the rest of the world, expected that, well, as soon as the Japanese sort of get their act together, get their troops into China in any numbers, the Chinese will be defeated, and then they will be forced to accept whatever terms the Japanese choose to give them. And the battle goes on and on and on. Days become weeks, weeks become months. There's sort of this black humor moment where the battle has been going on now for a whole lot longer than anyone expected. The Chinese are obviously putting up first resistance, and there's a Japanese army officer who is sort of the spokesman, the spin doctor, as we would call it. And an American reporter from the New York Times asked the guy, basically saying, well, you know, you've been going on now against the Chinese for month after month, and they're still fighting. How do you explain why you haven't already licked the Chinese? And the Japanese officer says, well, you have to understand, the Chinese know so little of tactics, they don't know when to retreat. Well, the Japanese win in Nanjing. It's a military defeat, but it's a political victory because, once again, you have to look at it from the perspective of the Chinese. No effective resistance against a westernized power for a century, and now in Shanghai, they've really shown that. And this is part of Chiang's deliberate calculation at that time. They needed a point to rally the Chinese people to the notion that this war, we might have defeat, but we can go on, sustain, and have some hope of victory. So this is what Shanghai represents to the nationalist cause. The Japanese, on the other hand, they decide that they're going to strike for Nanjing, which is then Chiang's capital, the capital of the nationalists, up the Yangtze River from Shanghai. Their belief is if they capture Nanjing, this will be the knockout blow, and the nationalists will have to, at that point, surrender. Well, that's not what happened. The Japanese get there, and what takes place is what's frequently now referred to as the rape of Nanjing. Between 100 and 200,000 Chinese military personnel and non-combatants are slaughtered in Nanjing, and the Japanese find out that no, the Chinese are not going to surrender, and the war will go on into 1938. Between April and November 1938, there's going to be a tremendous battle where the Japanese are driving on the Wuhan cities. A main force is driving up the river, up the Yangtze, with assistance of the Imperial Navy. Another force is striking in from the northeast in a second column to drive towards Wuhan. And it's the second column which initially sustains a defeat, but then they overwhelm the Chinese forces, and it looks like for a while in June 1938 as though this second force is going to break through and get to Wuhan, and Zhang and his senior leaders are very fearful that if the Japanese do succeed in getting to Wuhan cities that quickly, that could be a knockout blow to knock them out. And he makes the awful, horrendous decision to breach the Yellow River dikes, which releases the Yellow River, which floods 3 provinces. The total number of deaths from this flooding is estimated between 500,000 and 900,000 Chinese. Can you imagine an episode of this magnitude happening in the European war and you never heard about it, right? It's another illustration of how little we've paid attention to what was happening in China and in this part of the Second World War. It does stop the Japanese advance. The campaign goes on. The Japanese, again, eventually prevail. The column that comes up the Yangtze River, they turn in a report. They used poison gas over 370 times against the Chinese forces. It's their trump card to break Chinese resistance when it's particularly vigorous against them or whatever here. And in November 1938, the Japanese take Wuhan. But what's happened? Well, is this a Chinese disaster? No, they simply refused to quit. It's sort of like the American colonists fighting, we're kicked off of Bunker Hill or whatever hill, inflict some losses, but we still gain the notion that we're going to continue fighting, and we do. And this is very much what's happening in China in that period. More significantly, at the very highest levels of the Imperial Army, they write up a situation assessment, and at this point they conclude that they cannot conquer China by military means alone. From this point forward, they're going to try to use political means to set up rival governments to siphon away Chinese support from the nationalists. And they're also going to use a lot of economic warfare against the Chinese. And they're going to further attempt various other means, including a strategic bombing campaign against the Chinese. One thing that happens that a historian named Stephen McKinnon emphasizes is that in that summer of 1938 in Wuhan, there is the most free period of both political and artistic freedom that China is going to know now for a century. And it's a very interesting story in terms of this tremendous explosion of political freedom and artistic freedom. It also attracts a lot of Western journalists who, of course, are writing up the Chinese side in this horrific war. And that's a moment that the Chinese people still know about. The other thing that happens because of the tremendous atrocities the Japanese are committing wherever they go in China is produces this tidal wave of refugees heading out of all the areas that Japan has occupied or is threatened to occupy. Historian Ron Minter of Oxford, in his book, puts the total number of refugees who were in flight at one point or another during the War of Resistance between 80 and 100 million. I'm from Missouri, show me. So I'm thinking, well, 80 million would be like 20% of the total Chinese population. 75, 90% of the Chinese population lives on the farm. They depend for their existence in their farm or whatever. So I found another historian who says that the number's merely 45 million refugees. And it's just an unimaginable number. It's been called by a Chinese historian, I think quite accurately, the greatest migration in human history. And this is one of the great stresses that the nationalists have to wrestle with because they overwhelmingly flow into areas that are controlled by the nationalists at this time, dealing with this incredible tidal wave of refugees. The other thing that's going to be happening right now is the Japanese embark on what I call the most important naval campaign of World War II you've never heard of. The Japanese conduct a naval blockade of the Chinese Pacific coast. And the effects of this, in terms of their long-term effects upon the fate of the nationalist government, I think cannot be exaggerated. It does four things. Of course, it cuts off a resupply of munitions. The Chinese have stockpiled a lot of weapons and ammunition and equipment for this war with Japan. But as the war goes on into the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth year, they've gone through their stockpile. They don't have the industrial base to resupply. They depended upon receiving munitions from their allies, and the Japanese have just cut off the main avenue for that. They've also cut off food supplies, and although you think that China's food independent, it's not, particularly the provinces that are bordering upon the Pacific Ocean, some of the largest in population, are highly affected by the loss of food imports, which the Japanese cut off. The most important thing they do immediately is they basically drive the nationalists out of their original base area, those 7 provinces in the southern Yangtze Valley. The nationalists now are pushed back into the interior. They their main base becomes Sichuan province, which is well to the west, and the capital, wartime capital, becomes what we then called Chongqing, now we call it Chongqing. And it's well into the interior, which the Japanese cannot get to because there's no railroads or rivers that take them up there close enough. But the most long-term and disastrous effect is that the Chinese central government that Chiang had taken over from the dynasty and early republic period depended upon customs duties from trade in those ports for about 48% of its revenue. And when the Japanese conduct this blockade, they cut that off. They also occupy a lot of these cities and areas. They occupy areas that were great tax-producing areas from the land tax and the salt tax and various other taxes. Basically, one historian calculates that the areas that Japan cuts off or occupies with the blockade and their concurrent campaigns, those areas have been providing about 67% or 2/3 of the revenue to the nationalist government in 1937. By 1939, those sources had dried up to about 6% of the revenue that the nationalist government was getting from all sources. How do you make war without money? Well, you don't, you know. So what do the nationalists have to do? They have no choice. If they're going to continue the war, they have to print money and issue credit without any proper backing. And that's going to unleash tremendous inflation, which in the long run is going to do as much damage overall to the nationalist cause as any other cause in the entire war. So what I want to talk about now briefly is an area which I had no idea that this particular topic was going to come to me. It's one of those things about doing research and thinking and writing is that you see connections that you didn't see before or couldn't have seen before. And that's very much about what happens when I think the Asia-Pacific War and the European War become fused together. Now, formally, they become fused together in December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war by Germany against the U.S. and the Allies. That obviously is legally when everything becomes all signed with appropriate documents. But the point where I believe the two wars become so fused that they should be regarded as obviously one joint thing, is in July 1941. Let me tell you why. In June 1941, Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. When that war begins in London and in Washington, the assumption is the Germans are going to win because the Germans have won every single prior occasion except the British barely holding on in 1940. So that assumption is the dominant assumption. In the U.S., the official U.S. Army estimate is that the Soviets might hold out for 1 to 3 months. Then we come to an interesting point, which is how do we know what's going on this Eastern Front? Well, we don't. We don't have any independent observers there or whatever here. And I was looking at the intelligence reports we had, and they obviously didn't really know what was going on. And I realized from reading the diary of Secretary of War Henry Stimson that he was turning to the New York Times. And it turns out what the New York Times was doing, as they did through the entire war, is they print the official communiques of all the major combatants. The day after, obviously, is in the paper. So you could read what the account was about what was going on according to Berlin, what was going on according to Moscow. You probably will not be surprised to learn that these two accounts did not jibe very well or very often or whatever here. The only data point on which they did agree over a period of days or sometimes weeks was where the battle was taking place. And what that showed quite clearly from June 22nd to the last 10 days of July 1941 was the Germans are driving tremendously deep into the Soviet Union. Then in those last 10 days of July 1941, suddenly the front stabilizes, it stops. The German advance, and for the first time, there's actually the prospect that the Soviets might actually survive. And strategically, obviously, that is huge. So not only does that happen at that moment, but at the same moment, July 1941, Japan, which is now gearing up to launch its own, what they call Southern Offensive, they move into southern Indochina. They'd occupied northern Indochina in 1940. Now they occupy southern Indochina, which is a move which immediately threatens the British, the Dutch, and the American possessions in the Far East, presenting a dual crisis, both in Europe now and in the Asia-Pacific region. So if the Soviets might survive, what can we and the Brits do? Well, the answer is the Brits are overextended. We're not ready. The logistics of getting anything to the Soviet Union in 1941 are terrible. And the one thing that is recognized in both Washington and London is that the one thing we can do is to keep the Chinese in the war, to keep the Japanese from entering the war against the Soviet Union and delivering what they fear to be the knockout blow against the Soviets. And that becomes a key point of strategic thinking right in that immediate period, those last 10 days of July 1941, the first days of August 1941. That's the moment when the theory crystallizes, or the strategic vision crystallizes, that it's essential to keep China in the war to save the Soviet Union. What happens also is that Roosevelt and Churchill meet for the first time what's called the Atlantic Conference in August of 1941. Best known for what's called the Atlantic Charter, which sets out the goals for the Western Allies in the war. To that conference, Churchill brings with him Harry Hopkins, who was President Roosevelt's principal aide, sort of the equivalent of the Chief of Staff and National Security Advisor. And he's freshly back from a visit to Moscow. He'd originally gone to the UK, and then when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, Hopkins went on to Moscow. Has a private interview with Stalin, and Stalin gives the most candid account any Westerner has heard about the war to that point. And when Hopkins asks him what the immediate needs are, he says, we need anti-aircraft guns and aluminum. And Hopkins will emphasize to Churchill and Roosevelt, look, if he's saying he needs aluminum, he's not talking about something he can pull up from the ship and immediately go to war. He's talking about being able to process raw material to make machinery for war. He plans to hang on and survive, and he's confident he's going to do that. Hopkins also talks with the Soviet Foreign Ministry people, and lo and behold, they tell him, we want the United States to issue a public declaration that if Japan attacks the Soviet Union, the U.S. will enter the war against Japan. So now you have Washington, London, and Moscow all on the same page. It's critical to keep the Chinese in the war, to keep the Japanese from attacking the Soviet Union. So that, as I say, the road to Pearl Harbor runs through the Soviet Union and China. So meanwhile, what are the Japanese after? You have to remember, and this is, I think, has been missed a lot in a lot of the accounts, is that the Japanese are, their primary strategic issue is their quagmire in China. Ending that is the #1 strategic issue for Japan. And they want, in the negotiations with the U.S., they want us to do one of two things. And they're not very concealed about this. They want us to agree to impose a peace on China that will signify the Japanese have won, and the Japanese will be able to take to their people a justification for a war that's gone on now for 4 years. It's cost getting up close to 200,000 Japanese servicemen, lives at that point. Ultimately, they want us to agree to totally end all support of the Chinese military, economic, political, moral. And their belief is that China is abandoned and China will very swiftly be defeated and that will achieve their goals. And here again, let me point out that one of the things that I think has deceived a lot of the earlier accounts is that you have to understand that you have to read not only the Japanese, the bland language of the official position paper, like in September 1941, the Japanese issue a paper to us saying that what we want is, we want the U.S. to agree not to interfere with the settlement of the Sino-Japanese War. What you have to do then is you have to read the accounts of the Japanese diplomats talking to American diplomats both in Washington and in Japan. Well, what do they mean by this? And when you read those accounts of what they're saying, it's clear that what they're saying is, we want you to stop every bit of support for China, military, economic, political, moral support for the Chinese or whatever here. So Secretary of State Cordell Hull, President Roosevelt recognized that this is what the Japanese are doing. They're saying that, you know, the cost of coming to some sort of a settlement in 1941 is to abandon China or have China defeated, which, as you can see from our standpoint at that point, is totally unacceptable. So this also brings us to the great moment of the oil embargo, and now you can see this entirely different light. Before Roosevelt goes to meet Churchill at the Atlantic Conference, he issues a temporary embargo on Japanese imports of oil to Japan as a retaliation for the occupation of southern Indochina. Then, when he comes back from the Atlantic Conference, he lets the oil embargo stand. And what you really have to understand behind this is that Roosevelt is confronting a tremendous both moral and strategic dilemma. We've been providing the Japanese with 75 to 80% of the petroleum, which has been not only fueling their economy, it's been fueling their war against China. And if about 7.5 million Chinese are dead by July 1941, our oil has probably proportionally helped kill over 5 million of them. He's well aware of that. He's been well aware of that. But he also realizes if he cuts off oil, the Japanese are most likely to swoop down to the Netherlands, East Indies, and see the oil there. And he didn't think the American people would support a war to save a European colonial power. So he's stayed his hand until that moment. When you get to July 1941 and he imposes a permanent embargo, what you have to understand, he's not merely at this point retaliating against Japanese movement down to southern Indochina. What he is also doing is he's saying, look, you know, if we're terrified that if the Japanese attack the Soviet Union, the Soviets would be knocked out, are we going to provide the Japanese with the oil to go and do that? You know, you don't have to be a tremendous strategist to figure out what the correct answer to that is. And that's why we refuse to agree to open the oil spigot, as it's called. And the temporary suspension becomes permanent, and we lead down to the other evidence I found. The one foreign leader besides Churchill that Roosevelt confides in most freely is Canadian Prime Minister William Mackenzie King. And Mackenzie King meets with Roosevelt in November 1941. In his diary, Mackenzie King writes this sentence. He says, you know, look, if the Chinese, a collapse of Chinese resistance will probably mean a collapse of Russian resistance. In other words, they're making the connection between the continuation of Chinese resistance and the Soviet survival. And you get the same thing from the UK in a message from Churchill. And the background to this is even more interesting because just before he sends this message to Roosevelt, he's been consulting with his foreign minister, Anthony Eden, and Anthony Eden has been asking Churchill for guidance about the negotiations with Japan. And Churchill says, well, the important thing to remember is by no means, China cannot be abandoned, and we can't do anything that will help the Japanese to attack the Soviet Union. So this is very much on their minds. That's the path that leads Japan to launch this war. And this map, again, provided by John, this is where Japan's going to be by May 1942, with this great southern offensive, which I cover in the second half of the Tower of Skulls. From that, I go on to the second volume. I've deliberately set the volumes up so that volume 1 goes from July 37 to May 6, 1942, which is the day that Corregidor falls in the Philippines. The very next day, 7 May, is the first day of the Battle of the Coral Sea, which will start the slide of the Japanese. So what I end Tower of Skulls, the Japanese Empire is at its apogee in the history of Imperial Japan, and the next day, literally, the slide down begins. That goes to the end of the Marianas Campaign in August 1944, and then I'm going to pick up in September 1944 and carry on through the formal end of the war in September 1945, but then Volume 2 is going to get into this connections between what happens between 37 and 45 and the world that we've lived in since then and the world right down to today in the 21st century. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it very much.
Our veteran this evening is Denzel Alexander, and he was a guy that was trying to bring in logistics through the back door, as we're going to talk about a little bit here. Denzel Alexander was born in Kentucky and then moved to Detroit, where his father was a layout engineer for the automobile industry. You lived in Detroit, Denzel.
Yes.
How did you hear about Pearl Harbor?
Well, suddenly this program stopped and said, we're interrupting this program to announce that Pearl Harbor has been attacked by a large Japanese force. We don't know about the death and so forth, but we know it's great. And so that was my beginning. Yeah.
So what did you do? You tried to volunteer?
Yes. I was almost 18. I knew I was going to be graduating in a few months and perhaps be drafted. I really wanted to go into the Air Force. I went to the Naval Air Base, Air Force Induction Center to enlist. And they gave me an all-day exam. Half the day was written and the other day was physical. I passed all the written tests, passed all the physical, and was 5 pounds underweight. I was 5'11" tall. They called me slim. They don't call me that anymore. So anyway, they turned me down. I was very surprised. I thought, oh, a pilot ought to be light, you know. But anyway, they turned me down. So a few months later, I was drafted into the Army and put in the Engineer Corps, 1301 engineers.
And you did your basic training at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin?
It was Camp McCoy at that time.
Camp McCoy at that time.
Since become Fort McCoy. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then from Camp McCoy, you were in basic training. You were assigned to the 301 engineers.
Well, a little bit happened in between those two. While I was in the 301, yes. Anyway, it came up on the bulletin board. We know that the invasion is going to be coming soon. And we believe we're going to need a lot more pilots. And so if you're already in...
And so you picked up some weight by then.
Pardon?
You picked up some weight by then. You were a little bit heavier.
Oh, well, it didn't matter. They said if you're in the service, we'll count you as being physically all right. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in the service. So if you can pass the written exams, we'll transfer you to cadets, Air Force cadets. And so I said, well, I got it made. So I took the written exams, passed it again. They sent me down to Miami Beach with the cadets, and they booked me up in the New Yorker Hotel on the beach of the Atlantic Ocean, and we started not flight training, but preparation. Went on for about 2 months. In the meantime, the invasion in Europe took place, And if you remember, once they got off the shore, boom, Patton and his tanks, they went through France, you know, like butter, came up on the bulletin board. The invasion has gone so much faster than we expected, so much better. We've taken in way too many from the regular forces. So if we took you in from the Army after such and such a date, you will be returned to your unit. I missed that by a week. So there's a second time I missed the Air Force. Well, they sent me back to Fort Bragg, and my outfit had gone overseas. So I waited there a while, and then they put me in the 1304 Engineers, and later I went to Burma with that outfit.
And from Fort Bragg, in our discussion, you moved to Newport News, loaded on a ship, not knowing where you were going. You ended up going through the Panama Canal, down to Australia, ended up in Bombay, India. Tell about that.
Okay.
Tell about getting across from Bombay to Calcutta.
Yeah. Yes, we went all the way down under India. Of course, we went alone. We weren't in a convoy. And this was a very fast, General A.E. Anderson troop ship, sleek and fast. We could outrun a submarine. And so we went all by ourselves, and they took us down to Australia and then around and under India and up on the other side, Bombay. And we unloaded, got on trains, and went across India towards Burma. If you've ever gone across India, well, not now maybe, but 75 years ago on a train, you've had it. It was terrible. Take a minute here.
Tell it.
All right. You see, India at that time, of course, was under British rule. And each section of India, there were 3 big sections, and each India was controlled by a Maharaja, kind of like a dictator. They pressed with king. And so as the railroads started coming in, each one would have a company come and put tracks down by train to run the train back and forth in its part of the country. But when they got to a river, that was it. Well, then the next Maharaja did it some years later with a different company. And after a while, they had all 3 of these with railroads, but they didn't match. They were at different gauges. So when they took us by train to the river, they had no bridge, so we had to get out, sit on the shore, a whole battalion, wait while 2 men in a rowboat, about 6 of them, took us across the river. It took all day for the whole battalion. It was really something. I wouldn't want to do it again. But we got into Burma, and we were there to build a Lido Road. The old Burma Road, you know, Burma was like Florida, a long, narrow nation. And the Burma Road ran all the way up Burma into the Himalaya Mountains and over into China. Well, the Japs had conquered Burma. For us to try to come up through Burma, all that would have taken a long time and a lot of expense. So we came through the north, through the jungle of Burma, and built the Lido Road to hook up with the Burma Road right at the mountain and then go on the old Burma Road into China. So that's what our outfit did.
And your unit had the capability of Bailey bridges, float bridges, and you built wood bridges out of the native wood.
We had been, in the States we had been prepared primarily to build bridges. We were bridge builders. We built 3 kinds: wooden bridges for smaller streams, pontoon bridges for medium-sized rivers, and then Bailey bridges for larger rivers. And so we built those all the way across Burma. The jungle had a lot of streams in it, flowing down out of the mountains, sometimes just small, but they had to be a bridge there. Otherwise, you couldn't get trucks and tanks through it. So that was our job.
And you told me a story about how the Japanese would try to destroy the bridges?
Yeah. Well, Merrill's marauders had driven all the Japanese out of North Burma. But they would come up the river at night, and if they knew, they had spies up there, if they knew a bridge was just about finished, a big bridge, they would come up at night and try to dynamite the bridge or blow it up. So, of course, we had machine guns set up on both sides of the river and hidden back in the jungle. Any sign of movement, They were never successful. They never got to the bridge, but we did sink an awful lot of their boats. Yeah.
You also, one of the main ways, besides the Lido Road into China, the hump was a major. You had made some comments about your working with the hump.
The hump is what we call the Himalaya Mountains. Of course, those of you know, the Himalaya Mountains are considered the highest and biggest and densest mountains in the world. And the Burma Road goes weaved around through the Himalaya Mountains into China. But until we could take that again, the only way we could get supplies to China was to fly them. And we called it flying over the hump. If a plane was really heavily loaded, they couldn't hardly do that. They'd fly through the mountain. Himalaya mountain was like this. You just mountains everywhere. I have a little quick story here. We have a pilot who had some heavy equipment, special equipment, had to have 2 or 3 extra men go along to show the Chinese how to operate it. They took off and were flying through the mountains, and he went between 2 mountains and suddenly realized he had made a bad turn. He was in a box canyon. Now, box canyon is one that has a mountain. You go through 2 mountains, and it's boxed in by a mountain at the end. Well, the only thing he could do, he couldn't park anywhere, and he couldn't turn around. So he started trying to climb over that mountain at the end. Got up so far, and he thought it was going to stall out. It was shaking, trembling, and suddenly it came and it tore out the bottom of the fuselage, ripped a hole about that wide, about 6 feet long, in the bottom. Well, as soon as they got over, it started losing altitude because the drag of all that air coming in and pushing back was really slowing them down. So he said, men, we're not going to make it. The only thing we can do is all you men, there were 5 extra men on board. Well, heavy men, 5 of them could be close to about half a ton. And so he said, if you 5 men will bail out, they were all airmen, they had parachutes. The Burma Road is over here. We just got started. You can get back to Myitkyina in northern Burma by tonight. And so I'll go on. If I can make it, fine. If I can't, then I'll have to bail out too. But we never heard whether he made it. We kept asking, and every time we'd see an airman, did you hear about it? No. There were 3 or 4 landing bases on the other side of the mountain, so we didn't know where he had gone or if he had made it. So finally we gave up asking. Well, just quickly tell you, before I retired, when I was down in Florida pastoring a church, I was talking to my VA doctor. I said, Doctor, I'm retiring, I'm 90, and I'm going to go up north to Minnesota. And he said, oh, you're crazy. But anyway, he said, well, Denzel, I never did ask you, where did you serve? And I said, well, I was in Burma, in the Himalaya Mountains. Oh, my father was over there. I said, oh, was he working on the road? No, he was in the Air Force. He said, let me tell you an interesting story. So he started telling me about how his father had this plane load of heavy equipment, some extra guys trying to make it, tore the bottom out of his plane. You got to be kidding. I said, I've been trying to get the answer to that for years and years. Did he make it? He said, oh, yeah, he made it. He's here in Florida with me and my mother, where they live about 2 doors down. So, boy, that's putting things together, you know.
Yeah, that's great.
It really made you feel good after that long a time.
Any other stories you want to relate?
Well, you know, a lot of things happened in the jungle. Now, jungle is not like a forest. Forest is trees, jungle is just everything. And at certain times in between building a bridge, we had some free time, and we could pretty much do what we wanted to. So 3 of us decided to go out and explore in the jungle. Now, we didn't go out with the idea of being on a shooting expedition. We weren't going out to kill animals. We were just going out to explore. So we went out. I was in the middle. One was in front. There were trails in the jungle, but they were mostly grown up. The animals had used them, of course, for generations and hundreds of years maybe to get to water. And we got to a place where a tree had fallen over the path. The guy in the front jumped up on the tree, held onto a branch and jumped up, and then he did. Something came up the other side. It looked like this. You know what that is.
Cobra?
Yeah. That's a big cobra snake.
Oh.
You've perhaps seen pictures of Indians have a little basket here, and they open it up and start playing a flute. And that snake comes up like this. Well, this was a big one, big as around as my arm. And it was coming, and it was leaning over the tree and spitting at us. Well, this fellow fell off backwards. So the other fellow and myself shot the snake right away. We had our, of course, M1 rifles with us. We shot the snake. We decided we wouldn't go any further. So we thought we'd just go back to the camp. We'd been out about an hour or two and saw a lot of the jungle. Told all the guys about it, and they were all kind of surprised. We slept in tents. We had a tent that was a certain size, and there was a man on each of three sides in a army cot. How many of you know what an army cot looks like? Okay. You know, it folds up, and there's a wooden rod down the sides and canvas over it. And so there were three of us sleeping in the tent, and then on the fourth side there was a door, just a flap. About 3 days after this, I woke up somewhere in the middle of the night, pitch black. Sometimes it's like that. You know, the moon is not shining and it's cloudy, pitch black. And it was cool. It gets cold at night in the jungle sometimes. And I'm laying there looking around. I couldn't see a thing, but I kept feeling something on my chest. And I thought, what is that? And the most I could tell, it seemed to start down here on this side of the bed and come up to about here, and it stopped. And here it was wider, bigger, kind of like that thing that moved around. I was sure, and the more I thought about it, I didn't dare move big, but I would try to breathe a bit, and I could tell as I went up that movement was heavier up here at my neck. So I knew it was, I became convinced it was a cobra again, like we'd seen. And it had, you know, in the middle of the night, even though snakes are cold-blooded, they like to get into a little heat sometime. And so it could slip in that door. It was just a flap. Crawl across, get under the bed, feel my heat, come up like that, and onto the bed. I thought, what in the world am I going to do? My first thought was, well, just stay here all night. I thought, well, if I fall off to sleep and bring my hand up, boom. To be bit by a cobra in the jungle, forget it. So I said, the only thing I can do, my right arm is free. The left arm, I figured the snake was laying over the left arm and up to here. My right arm was free, so I thought if I can get up close enough and get ready, spread my thumb so that it goes under the snake and then grab it at the same time. Bring it up like this, grab it then with my other hand. Then I'll holler for the guys to come with their bayonet and some of them can kill it. Okay, 1, 2, 3. I couldn't do it. Second time, 1, 2, 3. I just couldn't do it because I kept thinking that thing would bite me right in the neck. Finally, I said, I've got to do it. So 1, 2, 3. I grabbed it, right, and all of a sudden I realized I had a hold of my arm. You see, what had happened is my arm had laid over that rod for maybe a couple of 3 hours. Anybody ever had their arm or hand or foot go to sleep like that? You know, you cut off the blood circulation and you lose control. I had no feeling in that arm, so the arm was laying up here like this, and it had this wide. I thought it was just, I'm shaking it, and I'm hollering. So they said, what's the matter, Denzel? They started to put on a flashlight, and I thought, now, if I tell them, this will be the end. I'll be the snake man. I'll be called the snake man for the rest of the time. So I said, well, I guess they just had a bad dream. Go on back to sleep. So we went, never heard any more about it.
Mike. Our next speaker is Mike Guardia. I met Mike down at Fort Bliss, Texas. Mike is from Houston. He got his bachelor's and master's degree from, now, don't you speak from over here? Yeah, come over here. From the University of Houston, got a commission, went to Fort Knox, ended up down in Fort Bliss. When my son was at Holloman Air Force Base, his publisher, casemate, said, hey, go see this guy. So anyway, we have connected and been here. He's now up in Minnesota making a full-time career of authoring and publishing. And we look to get you more active in our roundtable and our history. But Mike Guardia, tell us about a Minnesota connection. It was your first book, I think, right?
Right, it was.
Okay, Mike Guardia, welcome to the podium.
All right, thank you, John. All right, thank you very much, everyone. It is awesome to be here, and I just wanted to thank Don for the invite, and also to the Minnesota Historical Society for putting this event on. And let's see, I just want to make sure that the clicker here is working the way it should. So the subject of my very first book was a gentleman by the name of Russell Volkman, and this is the first book that I wrote when I was on active duty. This book came out in 2010. When I was in the military, I had kind of two careers going on at the same time. I was an Army officer by day and a book writer by night. And after I left active duty in 2014, I decided to carry it forward and just keep on writing. But the gentleman, the subject of my first book, Mr. Russell Volkman, has a unique place in military history for the very reason that he helped organize a guerrilla campaign in the Philippines after the Japanese invaded in 1941. And Volkman also has a connection to the lovely state of Minnesota. So Russell Volkman, he was born in Clinton, Iowa in 1911, and from a very early age, in fact throughout most of his childhood, he was the unofficial mascot of the 133rd Infantry Regiment, and in that capacity they were then part of the Ohio National Guard. They are now part of the 34th Infantry Division, which is headquartered right here in Minnesota, and he attended Shattuck Military Academy, which is now Shattuck St. Mary's School, right down the road in Faribault. And his connection to Minnesota continued after he graduated from West Point in 1934, when he was stationed right here in the Twin Cities area at Fort Snelling, back when Fort Snelling was still an active duty military post. Now, he joined the pre-war Army of the 1930s, and the army that he entered into was very small, and it was hamstrung by budget cuts and hamstrung by an adherence to the isolationism that was running rampant throughout the War Department at the time. But he requests for and he gets an assignment to the Philippine Islands. And in the late 1930s, the Philippine Islands really offered the best of Army glamour. If you were going to be stationed anywhere overseas, you either wanted to be in the Philippine Islands or you wanted to be in Panama. And he was lucky enough to be in the Philippines, and he thought that it was going to be a good move for him and his family, because despite the tensions that were rising in the Pacific, everyone was certain that the threat was going to come from Germany and the threat was going to come from Europe before it ever came from Japan. However, the narrative quickly changed in December of 1941. In fact, on December 8th, 1941, that's December 8th in the Pacific on account of the international date line, the Japanese invade the Philippine Islands. And the Philippine Islands at that time were in a tremendous state of weakness. The defense apparatus that was trying to build a Philippine army and the organic American forces there, they were really not in any condition to repel the Japanese invasion. And he found himself on the front lines of that defense force right at the top of northern Luzon. That's the northernmost island of the Philippine archipelago. And as the Japanese invaded, he was essentially telling himself, and he was given the order, how slowly can you lose? It was, you had to build a defensive line, then you had to withdraw, establish another defensive line, retreat, withdraw, retreat, establish another defensive line, all the way until you get to Bataan, because Bataan and Corregidor were the end of the line. Now, the order comes to surrender on April 9th, 1942. The remaining U.S. forces at Bataan at that point, those that had not been overrun or been caught behind the lines, as they moved farther south, were ordered to surrender. This was when General MacArthur got on his speedboat to Australia and said, "I shall return." Now, even though Volkmann was ordered to surrender, he refused the order. He said, look, I know what the Japanese are capable of. If the headlines chronicling the invasion of Manchuria have been any indication, I will take my chances in the jungle long before I rely on the good graces of the Japanese in one of their POW camps. And despite the fact that he was soliciting the idea to evade the Japanese and refuse the order to surrender, many of his comrades wanted nothing to do with him. They said, you're crazy if you want to go out into the jungle. We actually think the Japanese will treat us okay. But despite the lack of enthusiasm among his comrades, he did find an ally in the gentleman you see right there on the right-hand side of the screen. That right there is Don Blackburn. To the left is Russell Volkmann, and to the right is Don Blackburn. And together, those two escaped from the Japanese onslaught at Bataan, disappeared into the jungles, and over the next few months, they made their way all the way to the top of North Luzon, where they organized a guerrilla army to fight the Japanese. And for the next 3 years, their guerrilla organization grew to several thousand American and Filipino troops who had been caught behind the lines after the Japanese had invaded. And not only that, not only did they start making attacks on all the Japanese outposts and attacking key points of infrastructure, but he also reestablished contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia and started sending him intelligence reports saying, sir, whenever it is you guys come back to the Philippines, I've been carrying on a guerrilla campaign against them. I can tell you where they're the weakest. I can give you an entire layout of the enemy troop dispositions. And when MacArthur finally comes back to when he finally comes back to the Philippines in 1945, he meets Russell Volkmann on the beaches of North Luzon and says, Russ, you know, technically you disobeyed an order because I did order you all to surrender, but you killed so many enemy soldiers, I really can't be angry with you. So for your trouble, I'm going to give you not only the Distinguished Service Cross, but I'm going to give you a promotion to colonel. He went from captain to colonel in only 2.5 years. So he was rewarded for his trouble. And when the Japanese finally surrendered on North Luzon, the commander of Japanese forces made his surrender overtures not to General MacArthur, but he made the surrender overtures to Volkmann. And the cover photo that you see on this book right here, this is a picture of Russell Volkmann holding the katana of the Japanese commander of troops. It was tradition at the time that whenever a Japanese commander surrendered, instead of surrendering a sidearm, he would surrender a katana. And this is the very katana that Russell Volkmann is holding in his hand. And his friend Don Blackburn was the subject of my second book, Shadow Commander, because Blackburn, just like Volkmann, stayed in the military after the war, and Blackburn ended up commanding special forces in Vietnam. If any of you are familiar with the Special Operations Campaign in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, there was a group called SOG, Studies and Observation Groups. He was one of the initial commanders of SOG in Vietnam. But as for Russell Volkmann, he stays in the military after World War II, and he tells himself, look, for 3 years, I fought this guerrilla war against the Empire of Japan. Nothing in my professional training as a soldier has prepared me for this. I had to learn everything on the fly, and I had to make it up as I went along, and I had to do a lot of trial and error. Now, traditionally, when I look at my military education, he was telling himself this, everybody told me that guerrilla warfare was something I had to stay away from. It was an anathema. But I think it would be beneficial if we have a permanent organization within the U.S. military structure that is designed to conduct guerrilla warfare, and if we have a set of doctrines in place that teach conventional troops how to combat guerrillas in any warfare situation we find ourselves in. And that's when he was tapped by General Eisenhower, who came directly to him and said, Russ, I know about everything you did in the Philippines. Let's put it on paper so all of our troops can get a good grasp on it. And that was the beginning of Field Manual 31-20, Operations Against Guerrilla Forces. And this is a watershed moment in Army history because this was the very first counterinsurgency doctrine that we had on paper. If you play it forward, today's manual, FM 3-21, is almost a direct copy of the concepts that Volkmann put down on paper. And he took it one step further. The following year, he wrote Field Manual 31-21, Organization and Conduct of Guerrilla Warfare. And he said, if you take these doctrinal precepts right here and put them in a body within our current force structure, we can have a specialized guerrilla warfare unit to help establish the strategic goals of guerrilla warfare in the next conflict we find ourselves in. This right here was the birth of what we now know today as the Army Special Forces, and what makes him one of the founding intellectual fathers of the Army Special Forces. And this right here are the complementary books that I have written. American Guerrilla, that one being of Russell Volkman, and then Shadow Commander of his partner in command, Don Blackburn, who commanded SOG in Vietnam. Don made it clear I only had 10 minutes on the clock, so hope I made it worth your while.
About 20 years ago, we had a lady by the name of Judy Hyland speak, and she had written a book about her experiences as a missionary captured in the Philippines. And again, I'm going to let Phyllis tell the story. But the capture and the liberation, when we were meeting at Fort Snelling, we must have had 300 people in the audience. And when your mom finished her presentation, you could hear the audible sobbing of the emotion of it. So thank you for coming and relating your mom's story to the group tonight.
Thank you. I'm not my mother, and this is not my story, but I'm happy to share it with you. I have to start, though, by saying that my mother would never have spoken about her experience without first paying honor to our men in uniform. She had a very soft spot in her heart for veterans, and it would be remiss on my part not to say thank you for the service so many of you have given. My mother started out to the Philippines as a 28-year-old, headed for China, southwest China, to be a missionary teacher. In her luggage, she had her wedding dress because she was engaged and planned to marry my father, who was finishing seminary a year later. They left in October 1940. By the time, I don't know why a mission board was sending anyone to China at that point, but by the time they got to Shanghai, they were told they should divert to Manila, where they should wait until things blew over. An understatement by any measure. So they arrived in the Philippines in Manila, and shortly thereafter moved to Baguio, to the mountains, where they studied Chinese and waited for the chance to go to China. So my mother was walking down a street in Baguio on December 8th, 1941, studying her Chinese verbs for a test, when someone stopped her and said, "Have you heard the news? Pearl Harbor's been attacked." For a long time, for several days, they didn't know exactly what would happen with them, but by December 27th, they were summoned to the library of a local school where a Japanese military officer greeted them and said that they would now be guests of the Japanese Imperial Army. And they should gather whatever they could carry and come back to Camp John Hay for internment. My mother was in 2 different locations in Baguio, and I'm going to skip over that first part until December 44, when they were moved down to Manila, to Bilibid. The time that she writes about, she makes clear in her memoir, is not really about events. She has said many times that the biggest battle, aside from hunger and illness in internment, was really monotony and boredom, which was just broken by occasional spurts of fear. So she doesn't write about events alone. What she writes about is what continues to give meaning in the present, and she felt that that's what matters. While they were in the mountains of Baguio, they had various commandants. Some were kind, some were not. They were often deprived of adequate food and water. They lived with inadequate sanitation and medical supplies. Red Cross supplies were only delivered once, and generally they were taken by the military, the Japanese military. She lived in a community of 500 people in the internment camp. Half of them were miners, half of them were missionaries. Babies were born, more than a dozen. There were more than 30 children, so they established a school. They organized life. They made living quarters. The women and children were in one building and the men in another. They had a kitchen committee, which was the committee everyone wanted to be on because they were in charge of the food. But I'm going to move to the last part, last part of her experience. In December, they were moved suddenly down to Manila. And I want to read a little bit, just a few paragraphs from her book. It was a beautiful night with a nearly full moon. With mingled apprehension and joy, we noted signs of recent bombings along the way. Joy because it was a sign of American advance. Apprehension because we would be a perfect target on this road. Our apprehension increased as mile after mile we met the Japanese army retreating to the north. Did the American military have any idea that not only Japanese troops, but American prisoners were moving on the Kennan Road that night? Later, we learned that every night for 2 weeks, the Kennan Road had been bombed. The night we were on the road was clear and lighted by a full moon. We would have been a perfect target, but there was not a bomb those 2 nights our camp was being moved. Several years later, I was visiting in the home of a U.S. Air Force pilot who had been in on the bombing operations from Lingayen Gulf. He said that during the 2-week bombardment of Kennan Road, there were 4 nights when the planes could not go up because needed fuel supplies had not arrived. 2 of these nights, we were traveling on the road. Happenstance? No. They moved to Bilibid towards the end of December. Bilibid had just been evacuated of U.S. military POWs by the Japanese army. Anyone who could walk was taken away from the prison and put on ships headed for Japan, where they were going to be used as labor. Many of those men died of disease, lack of food and sanitation on the way. Many of those ships were bombed by the Americans, and the men were lost. The ones that were left in Bilibid were ones who were sick and near death. Bilibid was an old prison that had been built by the Spanish during the Inquisition. There were 3 gates, 3 successive levels of walls to get into the prison. And when they moved there, they were greeted by many, many rats. Many of the prisoners themselves had very dysentery. Everybody was hungry. There was no food. Many were listless, and so listless that there weren't even any good rumors circulating. More and more graves were dug each day. On the night of February 3rd, 1945, this was the 1,135th day of captivity. They had been counting. My mother was in the hospital cell block, working as a nurse, helping the military patients. They heard fighting, they heard bombing, and they knew that something great was happening in the city. The following morning, the afternoon of the 4th, they received a note from the Japanese guardians. The note said, "We are now leaving. You are free." In my family, we celebrated February 4th. Every year it's Liberation Day. They were free, but they couldn't go out in the city because it was too dangerous. There was too much fighting going on, but some of the prisoners stayed by the gate in case Americans should come by. And a day later, some did with some Japanese prisoners. They were surprised to find out that American civilians were in this prison. The military had known about Santo Tomas nearby, a university that was used as an internment camp, but not about Bilibid. So they sent some soldiers over, and they eventually were able to take them to headquarters for some food. But they had to return to Bilibid because the city was too dangerous, and with its fortifications, it was one of the safer places. She was repatriated later. Those with families were allowed to leave in April, and she left as a single woman later the next month. They were repatriated to Los Angeles and then took a train across country to Minneapolis. My mother talked about how she felt she was sleepwalking in those days. Too much was happening, too much just could not be explained. But she remembered to the end of her days the thrill of the day she arrived in Minneapolis. Arrived at the train station, the platforms were bare because of the regulations during the war keeping people off the platforms. But they took the elevator up to the lobby, and when the elevator doors opened, there was her family, her fiancé, her parents, her sibling, and friends, singing through tears, "We now thank we all our God." That, in a nutshell, is her experience, but I want to talk about the fact that she looked at all of this experience in her life in the light of her own Christian faith and experience. And I want to read a little bit from the one part of her book again. In January 1945, they were in Bilibid. They knew things were changing, but they didn't know how things would unfold. And so I'll start there. Early one January morning, I was crisscrossing the prison courtyard on my way to the wash table carrying a red fire bucket when we heard a plane overhead. We paid scarcely any attention, for there were single planes now and then. But this time, there was a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. This was a plane from America. Our country was back in the Philippines. We were wild with joy, hugging and kissing anyone near. But our ecstasy soon turned to horror, for the plane was hit and immediately became a ball of fire. The pilot tried to jump, but his parachute was immediately enveloped in flames. Yes, how much we wanted to be free, to live again, but no amount of wealth, no amount of wishing, hoping, or striving could open those iron gates. There was only one way, the shedding of blood. That was a boy from home, and who had given his life that we might live. She goes on, life is not a meaningless circle. There is a point, and at that point is a cross. There Christ fought a life and death battle with Satan, who held us in the bondage of the fear of death. So she saw her story in light of the Christian story. I think we children would add two narratives to the narrative she has in her book. One is a narrative of loyalty. My father waited 5 years for her. He had no word from her during that period of time. But he was faithful, he waited. He was a quiet man, but he was a rock. I think the second narrative we would add is that it is a narrative, too, of forgiveness. Mother returned in 1945. She married, and they served several churches. But in 1950, they moved to Japan, where they lived for 30 years and worked with the Japanese. When my mother first returned to the States, she was full of hatred for the Japanese, for the cruelty she had witnessed. But as she got to know the Japanese people, that earlier experience was juxtaposed against this later experience. And what she has written in this book is something of her recollections, her thinking about her life 40 years after her experience. If you have a chance, pick up a book. She writes a great deal about, in more detail, about her life. Thank you.
Let's do some Q&A. Any questions? Who's got the mics?
I was wondering to what extent there was resistance from the oil companies regarding the embargo. Was there some compromise that was made? How much of a percentage of their business was Japan? I still find it incredible that we were funding them throughout all of that. I mean, supplying the oil. Yeah.
Yeah, you can really, you get a sense about how Roosevelt very clearly understood the connection between American oil and what was going on in China, as did a number of members of his administration. But like I said, you know, what they were dealing with was what we call isolationism, or I would call non-interventionism, was a very strong current in the U.S. And the other thing was that Roosevelt believed that the supreme strategic threat was Germany, not Japan. And to the maximum degree possible, he hoped that if the U.S. would enter the war, it would be only against Germany, and we deal with the German threat first and not get embroiled in a war with Japan, which would divert resources from fighting Germany. The British were thinking along the same lines. The Soviets, at least up to the second half of 1941, also thought the same lines, that they wanted the U.S. in the war very much against Germany, but not against Japan. What the oil companies thought or didn't think at that point had next to no impact, as far as I am aware, from July 41 onward, or whatever here. And of course, after the war started, we were providing oil for the Brits and the Soviets throughout the war. So the oil companies, they were doing quite well during the war.
I think the commander of the Marine Corps, Vandergrift, he said that Amelia Earhart died on Saipan or something. Have you looked at any of the testimony that she was picked up by the Japanese?
The questions about, you know, the fate of Amelia Earhart, which has been a controversy that's gone on now for decades, and one variant was that Amelia Earhart was captured by the Japanese and taken to the Mariana Islands, and she died there. For a time, you know, let me spool back slightly on that. I think what you have to also understand, in the 1940s, 1950s, there was virtually no terrible thing possible to do that the Americans did not think the Japanese were capable of doing it. And those Americans who had lived through that period and knew what Japan had done during the war quite understandably had that viewpoint. Today, in looking back on World War II, we've emphasized, and with very good reason, Hitler and the Holocaust or whatever here. For the Americans who lived through that period, they understood, yes, Germany was awful and the Holocaust was awful, but they understood there was a very awful war going on in the Far East. As far as I'm concerned, with everything I've looked at, there's just no, I don't find any credible evidence that she didn't die as a result of the plane going into the ocean when they ran out of fuel off of Holland Island or in some vicinity close thereof, or whatever here. And I know we have an expedition that's been going on for years. They've been trying to find clinical or forensic evidence to support that, and so far, as far as I know, they haven't. But That seems to me to be the proper explanation of what happened to Amelia Earhart.
Well, listen, we're going to stop right now. Rich, Denzel, Mike, Phyllis, thank you for coming this evening.